So I will make an introduction, a more formal introduction. So thank you very much, Professor Alan Penn, for accepting this invitation, for talking here, making this conversation today for the class of Design History at HFT. Professor Alan Penn is Professor of Architectural and Urban Computing at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. Professor Penn is the former Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, and he's also currently a Chief Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Housing Communities and Local Government in the United Kingdom, and Chair of Space Syntax Limited, which studies the effects of spatial design on aspects of social, organizational, and economic performance of buildings and urban areas. So today, we would very much like to make this conversation, which is also exciting now in this time of the pandemics, to be able to understand and learn a little bit more about space syntax. And perhaps we could also make a little bit of connection on how now, specifically during the times of the pandemic, you have the opportunity of applying everything that all the knowledge you have about space syntax also to respond to the specific situation of crisis. So perhaps we could start our conversation here.
Absolutely. I don't know actually whether in this sort of thing, I mean, there's some really interesting aspects to what we're doing in the face of the crisis, which are behavioral. So until you have a vaccine, now we hope we have some vaccines. Until you have a vaccine, all you can do to control an epidemic of this sort is to rely on people to behave differently. And so all the wearing face coverings, washing your hands, standing a distance apart, is all about reducing the contacts between people, and therefore the possibility of transmission of the disease. And so the whole thing is to try and make the reproduction number, the R number, reduce. Now, actually what spatial structures in architecture do is they keep people apart and they bring people together. And so as a social engine, if you like, architecture and urbanism are about creating patterns of contact. And people like Jane Jacobs have written about that very eloquently, actually. The city is a mechanism for generating contact is one of her sayings. And of course, the reason for that, Jane Jacobs was an economist. The reason for creating contact is in part social, for communication, for meeting your friends and reproducing your social networks, but it's in part to create transactions and to trade things between each other. I'm sure in early civilizations we used to barter, and somebody with something they'd hunted in the savannah would come and trade the animal they'd hunted for something else that they needed, maybe the flint axe or something that somebody else had made. And so that bartering requires people to be in the same space at the same time. And so early settlements were about the creation of an early economy, a Stone Age economy, if you like. And today is the same. So the tension that the government now faces is between controlling the epidemic by controlling people's ability to get together and transact, and destroying the economy. And what we see going on around the world is that tension being played out in politics. Mm-hmm. So there's a very clear element of the architecture of buildings being at the center of the way that we think about what's going on in this crisis.
Yes, it's really interesting that you start by making also this connection with the work of Jane Jacobs, and specifically with the topic of economics, because the pandemic has also brought, in this regard, it made visible many possibilities, but also a lot of problems. A lot of the existing problems, so people who were in more vulnerable populations, or more also the precariousness of a lot of work conditions, this was all made visible. But at the same time, a lot of these possibilities that now we are using with Zoom and so on have also opened our eyes and our mind for other possibilities of establishing quickly a way to earn a living, for example, or as much as possible in an emergency crisis. So of course, these are all equally precarious and emergency responses, but they can also be used as an experimental ground to try out other solutions that in the future might actually bring towards more stability, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's been absolutely fascinating. The speed with which companies and governments and so forth have been able to move to working from home. The whole of the department I work in, MHCLG, within 2 weeks had gone from everybody being in the office to everybody working from home. And it had done it, it was smooth. There was no problem at all in making that transition. Everybody has their own problems at home. I've got a colleague who is still working on his ironing board, because he doesn't have a proper desk. But the work itself of managing a pandemic, which is not an easy regular piece of work, it's a brand new piece of work for a ministry, just happened instantaneously. A complete shift of organization over to digital working. Now, that would never have happened if it had been planned that we were going to do this. It took a crisis for this to happen. I have all sorts of questions about how much of this will stick after the epidemic. Will people just return to the office, or will they continue working from home? How much will will firms say, well, why are we spending all this money on rent of city centre offices if people can equally well work from home? But then, is it equally good? Because certain things, Zoom and Teams and these other technologies don't really support. So they're very poor, I think, at supporting serendipity. So supporting people to come into contact randomly. Buildings are very good at that. So if you're together in a building and you walk from somewhere to somewhere else, you pass somebody that you didn't know you needed to talk to. Yes, and then you meet them. Yeah. But in the Zoom world, you only talk to the people that you think you need to talk to, because you have to actively telephone them up and call them. And they have to be on the invite list. And so there's a risk that this technology will reproduce the existing structure of the network rather than generate new network connections. And so we probably need to evolve a whole set of new behaviors within the digital world to replace the randomness that comes from the real spatial world of architecture. Yes. Or we need architecture. We get back to working in buildings.
Yes, this is really an interesting point. And actually, it brings me to connection to one of the topics I would like to discuss with you, which has to do with big data and with algorithms, and how now we have more and more an understanding that algorithms are not as innocent as we would imagine, and they are actually very tendentious in sculpting our minds and our behavior in sometimes not only the best intentions, and we are very influenced by what's happening. And exactly this that you mentioned, I also experience currently this anxiety of thinking that we are somehow connected and we are able to function, but we are more and more isolated in our bubbles, and also our networks, even our professional networks. And it's really wonderful that we can have this meeting here, which in some ways it was a digital serendipity, if we would say, but it's also possible because we are connected through LinkedIn and through these networks, which kind of put people together who already have at least something that looks like something in common. But it's not exactly as you mean, this random chance encounter that someone can have with a colleague in the building or just with someone in the street. It doesn't bring the same diversity and the same mix. So somehow it can really reinforce these already established patterns, and for some people it can also become really isolating or even excluding. We also have to consider that there are people in the world now in the situation of pandemic that don't even have access to a computer still. And so this also affects probably how they perceive the pandemic and how they process what's happening.
Absolutely. Can I share my screen actually and just show you something
Yes, of course.
that I came across just now? Hold on. Yeah, let's see.
Is it possible now?
Host disabled attendee share. Hold on.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
you have to let me do it.
I think you should be able to do it now.
Okay. So can you see this?
Yes.
So this is the US election. The proportion that's blue is sort of the left end, and the portion that is red and Trump is at the right end. And the top little group of scatters are counties with more than 100,000 votes, and the lower ones are the counties with less than 100,000 votes. So this is small town America votes Trump, big city America votes Biden. Yeah. And the size of the dot is the size of the population, if you like, of the county. So for every county in the United States. So what you've got here is something that is saying that those who are really afraid of the other are those who are in the smallest local population. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to get the same thing now for the British Brexit vote. To see whether or not those were the same dimension. But this polarization between those who are, if you like, spatially isolated, relatively, into smaller groups. And these are polarization in ideological terms. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. Now, this wouldn't have been the case if you went back as far as Jimmy Carter election. Yeah. This has happened over recent years, and it may be that this is a result of social media and Twitter and Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and various other manipulations of social media. It's possible. I don't know. The dimensions of why this polarization has happened in society is fascinating.
Yes, actually our next class will be about this topic, and we will watch a lecture which is available on YouTube by Jaron Lanier, who he wrote this book, Why You Should Delete All Your Social Media Accounts. And this was already, I believe, 4 years ago. And there's also more recently, it's available on Netflix, a documentary called The Social Dilemma. And he's also participating in this documentary. And there's also statements by Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism and the Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontiers of Power. And so this social dilemma, I don't know if you saw it.
No, I don't know. No, that's a new
but then I would really recommend, because it's this group of people who are very involved in Silicon Valley, and people who work for Facebook and Instagram and all this crowd who were actually very enthusiastic about these possibilities. And they are all now at the moment kind of whipping themselves and saying, what have we done? And explaining that actually the way these tools are created really encourages this kind of negativity. And the algorithms bring together people who somehow express the same tendencies. So we have very quickly the formation of these clusters of people.
Can you give me the reference again?
Yes, The Social Dilemma. This is a documentary which is on Netflix.
Okay.
And the book which I mentioned before, it's by Jaron Lanier, and it's called Why You Should Delete All Your Social Media.
Okay.
And we will discuss it next week. If you would have time and if you would like, you can very welcome to join us.
I'll take a look at that. Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, for me, it was also a bit of an eye-opener, because I didn't know, but apparently Facebook, for example, was really designed in a way that works with the mechanisms of our mind. So this very simple system of reward and punishment, which works like slot machines. So we are basically addicted to being there and seeing if we are getting any likes or if someone looked at our post or not. And we more and more need to use it because we are always hoping that we will get something. So what these Silicon Valley authors also discuss is that basically it makes people depressed and negative because we are always somehow losing. It's much more the time that we don't get any reward than the time that we actually get something. And then we get more and more anxious about seeing if something is coming. And then this anxiety is somehow transported in the way that people interact with each other. And so people start interacting with each other based on this anxiety and also expressing all sorts of negativity and also tensions and building up and escalating these tensions. So
I think because there's another thing that's happening, of course, is that we're seeing a lot of conspiracy theories. And these are paranoia by and large. So the anti-vax movement, anti-vaccination movement, which has been around since the invention of vaccinations, of course. You know, the earliest vaccinations in 1790 or whatever were for smallpox using the cowpox vaccine. And if you look back at that time, the cartoonists in those days in the newspapers were spreading all sorts of rumors about people becoming bovine, looking like cows, because this was using cowpox. That this was somehow affecting people and making them behave like cows. So even back right at that stage, this was invented, but we still have it today, and it's very, very powerful. The anti-vaccination movement is funded actually partly by the Breitbart people, the same group, yeah. And it's very interesting. You know, what is going on there? Why is such large money being invested in conspiracy theories, the QAnon phenomenon?
yes.
These are very interesting social and political phenomena.
Yes, here in Germany, we also have this movement of the Querdenker who are also against the possibility of a vaccine and also against using a mask. And many of these people are also connected to right-wing, extreme right movement. So it's also something that that has to be monitored and has to be observed very, very carefully.
Yeah.
This could actually bring us to another topic, which I would really like to discuss with you in the context of space syntax, and also this topic of surveillance, because nowadays we are really dealing with these paradox and some dilemma that we know that we have big data, we know that we are being observed, and we can also be a little bit worried about our privacy and our democracy. But at the same time, as architects and designers, we can be very excited about the possibility of using these tools that actually allows us to track people, understand their movements, understand the movement patterns, and somehow interfere with this process. So I would hope that perhaps you would make a comment about this.
So, I mean, surveillance is an interesting thing because it works in both directions, or can work in both directions. So the Jeremy Bentham Panopticon was the invention of a building as a machine for exerting control. And it was, you know, perhaps the first time that somebody actively proposed the idea of a building as a machine for social control. Michel Foucault, of course, has written about Panopticism and should be on your reading list. The way the mechanism works is not that the guard is seeing you all the time. It's the guard could possibly see you all the time. You can't tell whether you're being looked at because the guard is in a tower with a narrow slot through which they look. So you can't actually tell whether or not you are being looked at, but there's the potential that you might be being looked at. Mm-hmm. And that then causes you as the prisoner or the hospital patient to behave properly. because the potential is that you're being seen. Now, if we think about today and new technologies, if you walk down any street in London, you are in constant vision of CCTV. And in fact, these were brought into London during the 1980s, 1970s and 80s because of the IRA bombing campaign. And we saw a massive increase in security camera, surveillance cameras going up all over London. And you don't know who's behind the camera. You don't know who is watching you. You don't even know if it's turned on, but there it is, it's there, and it forces you to change your behavior. They're using it for traffic, of course. And so if you park on a place you're not supposed to park, you can get a fine through the post because the camera saw you and they took a picture. So it's really very much emerged into society and everyday life that you are being continually surveyed, but not only that, that is being recorded so that you can be got at in future. There's a memory involved in this, not just an act of the guard watching you, but the guard is now permanently there, permanently looking at you because they are recording. Now, this goes even further, of course, because if you look at countries like China, China now has facial recognition for all of its population. And that means that they are able to use the face recognition software that we've all got sitting in our Facebook accounts that automatically labels up who your friends are and your photos. That sort of software in China allows the state to know who is walking through the train station. And they're actually selling that. So people in London have been buying systems that have the Chinese facial recognition software for installation in their shops and their urban precincts. And there's been a whole lot of worry about this because people then from the other ideological camp say, why are we buying things from China? That's a security risk and so forth. However, these are now a fact of life. People are signing up to, if you have a Facebook account, you have your face recognized, people know who you are. It's a really intriguing and rapidly developing sort of process. There's one other element of this actually, which is worth thinking about, again, with the new technologies, which is if you think about the blockchain, so that's the technology that sits behind Bitcoin, behind digital cryptocurrencies. This is a system that was invented in order to support transaction and an economy in a very untrustworthy group of people. So the dark web. So for drugs dealers, arms dealers, pornographers, and so forth, the sale of using cryptocurrency of goods, of drugs or whatever, which are illegal. So you have no comeback if through the courts of law, if the person doesn't send you the drugs you wanted. So they invented the Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, to get over that problem. How does it work? Well, it works by doing a very clever bit of cryptography that allows you to compress data into a very short piece of digital code that is absolutely verifiable that this refers to the document that you have created in the first place. So you compress a whole document down to 16 bits or 32 bits. And that is cryptographic. It's something which is an absolute match for that specific document. If somebody were to change a letter in that document, you would get a completely different 16-bit code out of the process, the hashing process. But then there's another element, which is that you leave versions of that document distributed on servers all over the world. And so there's a distributed ledger is what it's called. And that means that if somebody wanted to fraudulently change the documents, what is true is what more than 50% of the servers around the world say. Yeah. And if you try to defraud, you're faced with changing the servers all over the world, on computers all over the world, through this collaborative mechanism on the network. That makes it really hard to do. The Russians did try to buy up enough servers so that they would own 50% of the blockchain, but they didn't manage it. Yeah, it was too. It would cost so much money to do that they couldn't achieve it. So there's something really interesting there, which is that for a very untrustworthy group of people trying to transact, that what you rely on is distributed knowledge, that the information sits everywhere. And that information itself is these hash codes, these very, very short pieces of blockchain, if you like, which allow a very untrustworthy community to engage in transaction and to engage in economics. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's fascinating because now people are using this for all sorts of legal purposes. You know, the next people in there are highly trustworthy people like banks and
Elon, well, I wouldn't say very trustworthy, but Elon Musk.
I'm joking.
Elon Musk is also very interested in Bitcoin. He's one of the big supporters because he thinks it can really challenge the way our economy works. And it can really completely revolutionize the way we deal with money and any ideas we have about money.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But it's tied to the issue of surveillance, and it's tied back to architecture in the form of the Panopticon. So I'm interested in this because of the need to be able to certify in architectural projects whether or not the people who said they checked the building for building control, for building regulations purposes, actually did check the building. Yeah. So what I want is to be able to certify that this set of regulatory checks took place, so that you can actually point back at who was it that failed in the system. Because unless you can point at who failed in the system and they're being surveyed and observed, it's possible that they accept a bribe from the building contractor to just not look, or to look the other direction when they're installing the fire containment or whatever else. And then you get problems like the Grenfell Tower burning down. Yeah. So these are, you know, surveillance is both good and bad potentially, but these technologies are also coming into that area of what used to be surveillance, used to be just people looking, and now it's all become mediated by digital electronic media, even things as odd as the blockchain.
Yes, well, this brings me to another thought, because of course we are very focused on the issue of digitalization, and because it's also one of the main components of this conversation. But we also can perceive that we are more and more digitally dependent. And this is also somehow a little bit disturbing. Because we can already feel that our dependency from technology, from these digital technologies, has not so positive effects in the way we interact and in the way also we feel with our bodies. And we have digital fatigue, we have cognitive overload. Our bodies and brains, they are not used to processing all this information and to make sense of all this information. And it's also nice to just be able to look around and breathe the air and not constantly be depending on technology for everything.
So I'm yes, I don't know. I'm a sort of I think people invent these technologies, and people have invented technologies since, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, and we are. You know, we're continually changing and continually evolving in our relationship to the things, the material objects, and, you know, the informational objects that we invent. So I don't think there's necessarily good or bad in the technology itself. There are certainly good and bad that can be in how people choose to use it, but that's people. Until now, when, of course, we move on to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so the point is approaching very rapidly. We talked about algorithms just now. The point is approaching very rapidly where the machine itself will have a high degree of autonomy. You can already see it with, these apparently, well, what 10 years ago would have seemed amazing, facial recognition in Facebook that can tell who your friends are and put names on them. That was unthinkable a few years ago. It's only with, sort of neural networks and convolution and that set of technologies that allow you to understand and to teach the machine that becomes possible. But the next step is for the machine itself to become creative. And that's possible. We've got people working on that at the moment about, architectural creativity and computational creativity. Is it possible for a computer to automate the design and have creative insights into design possibilities in buildings? I'm sure it is. Yes, I've supervised PhD students who have tried to do that and have begun to make inroads. I'm sure that this will move very rapidly. You have a look at things like the ability of the deep neural network to play Go, and not to win by learning rules that people have taught, but to learn new rules and have an inspirational move. I think it was move 37 or something like that in the Go game that the computer made, and that all the Go experts thought, what on earth has it done? And of course it had done the winning move, but there was something that was so unlike anything that would be in the repertoire of a Go master that it completely surprised them. And now that's creativity, and it is interesting. So with that set of things coming over the horizon, then there are questions. At what point do you grant autonomy to the machine? And do you consider it as having agency? That's approaching rapidly. Yeah.
Yes, and here I also have a lot of questions, also connected with my own recent and research interests, because you might remember that I work with performance art as a learning tool for architects. So I'm really, it's really my point and my position that we really have to keep continuing working also by hand, drawing and doing models, and especially doing things with movement and with the body in space to not be completely dependent only on digital methods to expand our possibilities for creativity, because I think we would have never reached this possibility of having such tools if we would not have the body we have, and if we would not have the possibilities we have. So we always have to have a balance of both things. And I still think, although I am not anti-technology, and I also love the possibilities of technology, but I am still suspicious of the way current technology is designed, and especially after what I learned now about Facebook and also a lot of these devices, that they are designed in many ways to be addictive. And the fact that we become addicted to them somehow can also make us think that our creative possibilities have to be somehow dependent only on these digital possibilities. So I think it's really important to cultivate a balance between both approaches.
I have a short question. Yeah. So I have a short question about the perfect. Thank you so much. I have a short question about those algorithms being creative, because if we get to this point, what will happen in the future, in the near future? I'm definitely. I think that this will happen. So I have to think about what makes a human. So what makes us special? If we can replace ourselves by algorithms, I mean, there's not even talking about like relationships. We can have relationships to algorithms. Has already happened. I mean, those artificial intelligence with whom you can talk to or you can have a conversation with, and therefore also this conversation fact or this conversation part is probably not human or not human enough for us. I don't know. So if we get the algorithms to being creative, what makes a human even more? So what is the sense for our lives again? So this is probably always the main point.
I mean, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that question. That's a very deep sort of a philosophical question. Ultimately, of course, humans have written all the algorithms, and humans have even written the algorithms that become self-learning algorithms that write themselves. And so actually humans can't kind of get out of their responsibility, if you like. And it will be a very creative human who will make a very creative machine, if you like. It will take a very, very creative team of humans. So at the moment, I think my answer is that what humans do is they socialize as large numbers. So there's a Ray Kurzweil has written about the singularity. And the singularity is the point at which an artificial intelligence becomes more intelligent than a human brain. Now, of course, this isn't a problem for us because we've got thousands of humans, billions of humans. And if you look at any real creative enterprise, let's take an architect's office, there may be 25, there may be 50, there may be hundreds of people working in it. And they work in teams. And it's not just, you know, the great Norman Foster that designs everything. He happens to be there and he's very important, but he has teams of people working who are being creative. It's that ability for people to come together and to work creatively together on a creative enterprise that I think is something we've inherited actually from our primate ancestors. You know, it's the social animal or the hunting predators or whatever we were who collaborated together to achieve their goal. That is why we have human progress. So it's that collaboration, ability to collaborate, which is key. Now, there is no doubt that the artificial intelligences we create in the future will also be able to collaborate. And they will collaborate with humans, and they will collaborate with each other potentially. And that collaborative ability is all important, yeah. But at the moment, I would say that we're going to be ahead of any single fastest computer because you just have to add another person and you've got another billion brain cells, yeah. And that is, I mean, it's actually really interesting if you think about how architecture works, because in order to collaborate on an architectural design, what do? We externalize the idea in my head through the act of sketching or material manipulation, model making out there in the environment, and somebody else in the team looks at that and interprets it differently to the way I interpret it. So I've externalized an idea into the material world. The team members look at that externalization, make their own interpretation of it, and then contribute to that by externalizing whatever ideas they have. Those may be verbal things that they say, they may be graphical things that they draw or material, yeah. And if you watch designers working around the design table, they keep grabbing the pen off each other in order to add to the sketch. That process, which is something Donald Schoen has written about as the reflective practitioner, is absolutely part of how humans exist as creative agents, if you like. Now, I don't know if that's a good enough answer for the moment, because the machines will be collaborating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're definitely right with the point that right now in the moment, we're not at that point already. Probably it's a good thing that it will take some time until computers or algorithms be more efficient than humans or more easier in connecting, probably as well. Yeah, but I definitely agree with those
I mean, I
working
think
together. Yeah,
actually computers have a great advantage over humans, which is at the most fundamental level, everything is digital, and it's either 1 or 0. And yes, there's noise in the system and errors creep in and all the rest, but there's much greater certainty than there may be in the sort of chemical and biological mechanisms that we all rely on. We're much more analog. And so the analog actions, I think, are something which at the moment distinguish humans from computers. One of the really interesting sort of pieces on this, I think it was by Andy Clark, the computer scientist, who wrote about the important thing about robots is that you have to make them physically in the real world, and they have friction, and they have sort of constraints from imperfections in the way they're made. And that actually makes programming a robot to do something easier than if you're trying to do a completely virtual digital version of it. You can design a digital robot that dances on your screen that doesn't have gravity or friction to deal with, and it will perfectly execute its algorithm. As soon as you make one of those Boston Dynamics dogs that has to walk around, you're into a real world with friction and stones and things that can go wrong. And that actually is easier to make it do things than it is in a friction-free world. Yeah, so you need to read the Andy Clark paper on it, which I can't remember where it is, but it's probably in the philosophy of artificial intelligence, which Maggie Bowden wrote. I think it's one of the chapters in that. But it's a really interesting argument on the relationship between embodiment and materiality, and even in the digital world for the robot.
I just make a comment, and then I want to invite more of our students to bring their contributions. I find it very interesting that you mentioned now specifically with the robots that actually things get more interesting with the physical robots as they have to deal with their own imperfections. And here I make the connection also with our own strength as humans, because our biggest strengths come exactly from our imperfections and our vulnerability. In fact, our need to create these really sophisticated technologies and architecture comes from this vulnerability we have, that we need to extend our bodies just to survive in nature. We can see in this way clothing as technology, building as technology, all the things we need basically to survive. And this comes exactly from the constraints and the vulnerability we have. So what we could say, those imperfections.
Yes, and this is deeply related to the fact that we only learn when we make mistakes. You don't learn anything when you intend to do something, you do something and it works, because it might be working for reasons other than the ones that informed your intention. Yeah, but when you form an intention, you think all my best theories in the world are right, this will work, and it doesn't work, then you understand that your theory must be incorrect, or your execution was incorrect, and then you learn. Yeah, so you only ever learn from mistakes.
So we could extrapolate that in the future, our extremely sophisticated machines will be the ones that actually do a lot of imperfections.
Yeah, you have to design in imperfection, I think, to make the most, and I'm sure we will be very good at it.
Yes, well, but this is also what's frustrating, because when we work with machines, for example, some years ago, I did experiments with emotion measurement. So I wanted to see, and it was just so difficult because the sensors they don't stick right and they're unstable, and we got all sorts of data which was difficult to control, and then the people also get a little bit impatient, and it's also not nice to have all those things attached. But from the performative aspect and also the phenomenological aspects of the experiment, that was really successful, because you can see how people react in that situation and how the body has to adapt to make the situation work at the same time, and also performing as natural as possible in a simulated environment, although it's a material environment somehow, but still in an artificial setting. So from the performative aspect, that was also something interesting to observe, due to these imperfections and these things that don't work so perfectly.
Very good.
I don't want to talk too much, because I really would like the students to take advantage of this opportunity. So please, more questions.
So another thing we already talked about in our like room draft class, so our probably our main class in our studies. This semester we are designing an office space. Probably not office is probably the wrong word, but talking about new work and how is new work, what is new work, especially under these circumstances of COVID. And I think it's very interesting, because this private space or this private working you have, like with yourself, you don't have to do this in a building, you don't have to do this in an office, you can do this at home, at home working, yes, like home working kind of. And I think what we all have thought about is that new work is about the communication, the working together, the bringing people together actually. And another thing I wanted to contribute is talking about COVID again, that thanks to COVID, probably we are able to are not bounded to the or that we don't have those spatial boundaries. We don't have to be in an office, probably at one point we have to be, especially when working together. But this talent hunting expands on an international level.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. I mean, I can reflect on some of these things. It used to be that I would take the day not in the office to work at home if I had some concentrated activity to do. I needed to get a paper written, or I needed to do real work, contemplative work. And I would seek out isolation, and the home was the place that was isolated. Now, of course, it's invaded by you. Yes, all of the my private space here is full of 25 students from Germany.
37, it's even more.
What?
37, we are 37.
37, oh yeah, 37, you're quite right, yeah. You're in the most segregated piece of space in the building, actually, which is my office on the top floor, yeah, in the house, right the way at the top. And this has now become almost the most public space. In fact, interestingly, downstairs in the kitchen, I've also plugged in a Facebook portal, which my sister bought me yesterday, which is something which is amazing. It's really good technology. But that is now a surveillance space, which is for family network reproduction. So all my siblings and their families are on the Facebook portal, yeah? And so there's a division here. This has become for interactions outside the house that are essentially work related. And down there has become the family related, technology enabled interactions in the kitchen, not in the living room. Sometimes we move into the living room for the Zoom party with friends or whatever. So there's some really interesting things going on in how people live their lives in their houses, in domestic space, and the way that media and technology are, I think, finding new places in that space. Now, what does that mean for the office? Well, we had, I work in the ministry 3 days a week. the minister very much over the summer, very much wanted people to go back to the ministry building, in spite of the fact that all the science says you haven't killed the epidemic until you've killed the epidemic completely. Yeah, so all the science, but the minister was saying, no, 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 we've got to get back to work because the economy is suffering. And so just in order to keep the sandwich shop going over the road, he was keen to have all the civil servants back in the ministry. So I said, well, you know what? I'm not going back in until the pubs are reopened and there's a reason to go back in so that you can have the informal conversation with a glass of beer with the colleagues, because that's the real reason for going in, because this mechanism is perfectly good for systematic procedural meetings. In fact, this is better. One of the things I've noticed with this is because there's a chat column down the right-hand side, the quiet people can always type their question in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they do in meetings. You'll get meetings with 60 or 70 people in, and people who in the real world would never have raised their voice because they're too junior or they're too quiet or their personality or whatever else. They're typing very good questions into the column. Yeah, and those questions then get answered. When you have the show of hands, the person who's chairing the meeting can see who showed their hands first and they called it down in order. And the whole thing becomes much more democratic. It also means that you have people in the room, in spite of the fact that some are in Australia and some are in New York. It's amazing the degree to which we have expanded globally the network of expertise that we call on, and how quickly you can do it. So at the beginning of the COVID thing, one of our groups that was trying to put data together wanted the retail operations, the Aldi, Lidl, Tesco, these people, they wanted their data. And I was able to put together the meeting to get the data from those companies within days. It was possible to call on contacts and to get and to have meetings and to get data exchange going in a way that, you know, without this technology wouldn't have been possible. And without the crisis also wouldn't have been possible. So the crisis itself has a very interesting effect. It catalyzes change and catalyzes social connection and interaction. So I think there's some really positive things about it. But the question of what the future of the workplace will be, the future of the office, is fascinating. I'd be very interested to see what results you come up with. But it requires some real creative thinking. And it will be hybrid. It will be partly these technologies, partly real space. And there will be questions about what, I mean, I could talk about space syntax and work environments if you want. That's one of the areas of that we've studied in quite some detail.
I have a question that kind of connects to that and also to something that was said pretty much in the beginning of this conversation. Like, is changing the structures, the social structures of, for example, Zoom meetings, making it a little bit more random, giving it this kind of opportunity-based social patterns that we have in buildings. Is that something that we as users can work towards, or is that also something that maybe will always remain connected to the physical buildings, that we always need to have places to come together and then have the second channel of Zoom and video calls and digital meetings?
So about 20 years ago, I was in a project, actually a project with led by the GMD in Cologne, so one of the Fraunhofers now. And there's a project called Tower, actually. If you look up Tower as a European funded project, you'll find it. And what we were doing was creating a landscape, a virtual landscape, to support work in offices and to support serendipity, to support random interaction. And the idea was that this landscape would contain the material or material representations of the assets that you work with. You may have documents and drawings and building models and, you know, a whole lot of stuff, that would have material appearance in a landscape. And the idea was that this landscape would generate itself automatically, but with an intelligible logic to it. So the reason we were involved was because of the very early space syntax work on how settlements generate, so automatic design, if you like, of settlement generation. Then the next part was that there would be avatars that would represent the workers, the people. And you would all have your own avatar, and that avatar would inhabit the landscape. So if you were working on, you know, some aspect of a project to do with writing a document, let's say, that you would be next to that representation of the document in the landscape, and that people would be able to see that you were very busy working away at it because the avatar would represent it to, yeah, make that representation. If somebody wanted to interact with you, they might wait until you stopped doing that and walked off to get a cup of coffee before interrupting you, just as they would in the real office. If you go into a real open plan office and people are sitting there concentrated work, your colleague who may want to speak to you will wait for you to finish your concentrated work, it's just polite, before they'll say, Alan, I've got this question. Yeah, and that's why corridors and water coolers and elevators and so forth, these places are the locations where these conversations very often happen, is because you're catching people between their concentrated activity. So this idea that the world of work moves between concentrated and interactive, contemplating specific things where you're using your mind and some media and material that you are working with intimately, and then other things which are much more interactive between you and other people and conversations and so forth. And that those are either formal in the form of meetings like this, where everybody is sent a date and a time to be on, you know, to be in the room or to be in the Zoom call, or they are things which are much more random and spontaneous. These are the dimensions of actually social interactions in general, I think. I guess we should throw into that, you know, there are other social interactions which are very often you see in healthcare, which are between bodies. So people caring for other people, where you are manipulating the body of the other person. And, you know, that set of things is a different class of work, haircutting and and manicure and facials and so forth. Those sorts of activities are a different class of work that people engage in. And then there's the construction work, of course, people actually who construct the environments in which we exist. And then there are the digital constructors who construct the media like this one that we're interacting through now. So all of those aspects of what the world of work is tend to be constructed in this way of between contemplative internal thinking, externalization, working with others. And you need environments to support those different things. I don't know if that helps. I mean, this is a bit of a ramble, you see, the stream of consciousness, really.
No, it definitely helps, and it made it a lot more clear for me. What I'm not so sure about yet is how or should it be a goal to implement these structures in digital media as well, or like,
yeah, I'll tell you something.
Keep it in the physical world.
If you take computer scientists and engineers who construct the digital world like this, they come from one end of the Myers-Briggs score. If you know about Myers-Briggs, the kind of psychometric chart. Yes, the engineers of the world are at one corner of it. Architects should be from a different corner. Yeah, sorry.
The INTJs probably.
Yes, the architects should be from a different corner, and you need both. Yeah, it's quite. I mean, okay. What I'm saying is that the way that people and different professions behave are related to particular qualities of the way they think and way they practice, and the form of interaction, and their form of interaction the tools that they use, the media that support them, and so forth. And there is a need for these digital technologies to have more architectural creativity and more architectural insight and ways of working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Architects are very good at this part, by the way. So architects very often end up as working nowadays in user experience in digital companies because they're trained in a different way to the engineers, and that's complementary.
May I ask about the rules in your space syntax? I guess in your criteria for people's movement through space. Is it completely rational? Are all the rules completely rational, or do you have a set of rules that deal with the emotional decision making of people taking certain routes? For instance, if I had an avatar in your system, it would be a person who would walk one way to get to a place and take a different way back home, or who would rather go the way with a beautiful scenery.
Okay, so the first thing is that you've got a slight misconception, I think, in what space syntax is. So let me try and describe that first. Space syntax uses a form of representing the pattern of space in buildings or in cities as a way of helping you to compare two different designs. Now, it might be that you've got two different urban areas, one urban area that everybody thinks is lovely and has a sense of place, and another area that seems to be anonymous and has much less sense of place. But on the surface, they may have very many things in common. They may have both been made of brick with pitched roofs and painted doorways or whatever. They may have even have been designed by the same architect. But one seems to work really well socially and the other seems to fail. So what we're trying to do is to control the spatial relation variables of architectural design. How the spaces, the streets, the squares connect to each other so that we can compare one with another on the same basis. Now, one of the problems with architecture is that every building is different. And so unlike the medic who, in studying lots of people, can do case control, give one lot the placebo, the other lot the vaccine, see which ones get sick, and say, well, this one is 90% effective, this vaccine, because almost everybody who caught the COVID were from the placebo group. Yeah. You can't do that with buildings because every building is different. Everyone is an individual. You certainly can't do it with cities because every city is an individual. And even if two buildings, two tower blocks, let's say, are precisely the same in their design, at the urban scale, they're located in different places. So at some scale of spatial structure, like the relationship to the city, they're different. So that's what space syntax set out to do, is to give a method of representation of architectural space to allow studies of different patterns of function and performance. So what did we find? Well, what we found was that the way people move around cities as aggregates, as statistical populations, is actually relatively predictable. Now, what we're not doing there is predicting the individual, whether you, Elizabeth, will go left or right, whether you will choose to go the same way to the market or back from the market. What we're doing is we're saying there's a statistical probability that by and large, as a member of a population, you may choose that way rather than that way. Yeah, so 80% may go right, 20% may go left at the end of the street. But we can't predict what you will do as an individual, because if we were to make that prediction, guess what? You're an autonomous individual and you would do the opposite just to show I was wrong. Yeah.
Which would show my dependence, because my reaction would be dependent on your prediction.
I know we get into all sorts of really nasty philosophical debates here about who's second guessing who. Yeah. But the point here is that what we don't have is a set of rules by which people operate. Now, we do have, we have generated some little computer simulations. I don't know if I showed the one, did I show in the talk the one with IKEA and little agents moving around? So those little agents are moving around, yeah? Yes, they have rules, but the rules, let me describe the rule to you. The rule is, these are agents that have eyes in the front of their head, so they have embodiment, and they have forward-facing vision, so they see sort of some field of view ahead of them. That field of view is constrained by the building objects in the way, so you can't see through the wall, but you can see through the doorway. And so your relationship as an agent to an environment with walls and doors is something which gives you a field of view. And the rule is very simple. It is select a point at random from your entire field of view. And you can see off into the distance, if down the corridor, yeah? It may be the point is at random is down the corridor. It may not be, it may be right in front of a wall. You then turn towards the point that you've selected at random. So it's now in the center of your field of view, and move forwards for 3 steps. Or until you reach the point, actually. And then you do the same thing again. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you are facing a wall, and you can imagine you're just sitting there as an agent facing a wall, there's actually space to left and right of you more than there's space in front of you. So there's, yeah, so at random, it's likely that it'll either be this way or this way. You then turn and you see along the wall down the corridor. Then at random, there's more space in the distance than there is in proximity to you. You tend to follow corridors. So by throwing that very simple rule system into IKEA, what we saw was the agents reproduced that very sinuous movement pattern that goes through backwards and forwards through the IKEA showroom, the first part of IKEA that you walk into. Now, part of the argument is that actually IKEA, for fire escape reasons, has shortcuts. You don't have to follow that sinuous route to escape. If you look in IKEA at where the thing says means of, fire escape, little green signs, they indicate the routes which are not necessarily the routes that people are following. And that's because IKEA has very carefully designed them to be always behind you. So the elegant part of that piece of research was to understand the logic that the designers had created in IKEA that meant that people didn't see the shortcut, but they took the long route that took them past all the goods. Yeah. And that is fascinating, partly because you very rapidly become disoriented, this movement that takes you backwards and forwards with no reference to the outside world. There's no windows to the outside after you've gone through the entrance. You get very disoriented very rapidly. And in that situation, what you're doing is you are passing control of yourself to the store. Yeah, so this is my theory. My theory is that what IKEA does is it takes the individual, deprives them of autonomy, and actually deprives them also of a sense of time. You don't know how long you've spent there. So that when it lets you downstairs where you're allowed to pick up a trolley and you're in the marketplace, you're already completely lost. And the first thing you see is something really cheap. I don't know, glasses at €1 a box of 6 or something. And you think, oh, that's good. I'll never find that again. You put it in your trolley. So something like, I think, get whether it's 60% or 80% of IKEA's sales are impulse purchases, things that people make just on the spur of the moment that were not in their shopping list when they arrived. Yeah, they may have come for, I don't know, tea lights or something, but or light bulbs, yeah, But before they get to the light bulbs, they've already got a frying pan that they didn't realize they needed, and a set of knives and all sorts of other things. And those are all in the trolley. And then you get to the queue at the end, and by that stage, you've spent so much time, you think, oh my goodness me, and and then if you try to return anything to IKEA ever, the queue for the returns is impossibly long, so you don't return it, you throw it in the skip. Yeah.
So there's the emotional part, I guess, the irrational that is being considered. It is being considered, but
it is highly considered, highly manipulative and highly considered, I think. And you can see it in their advertisements, actually. If you watch some of the IKEA advertisements, they are incredibly sophisticated and manipulative. I mean, I think it's fascinating.
But this is something you have studied and analyzed, but not. But is this something that you are
on IKEA and on shopping in general, actually, that you can read?
But I would think this is not something that that you are recommending for your clients when they come to you.
Oh, I don't know. I think IKEA is the most successful, or was at one stage the most successful sort of household goods firm in the world. They're very profitable. I think it's manipulative. I think I have my doubts about the ethics of it, personally. However, if you have a look at what's happened in COVID, every store in the country is now trying to make people go on a single route, one direction. All over the world, people are doing this now. They put little arrows on the floor to tell them to go one way or another. Yeah. And so all the retailers are following IKEA now in terms of how they're making their places COVID safe. Perhaps for better motivation, but it's the effect is interesting.
So perhaps we can think that we can use the manipulative principles with the highest ethical standards, and then maybe we have a good balance between those things. But I would also like to remember this really interesting idea of the situationists in the 50s of the psychogeographies, and this idea of the dérivé, to appropriate the city exactly in random ways and in ways that the city was not meant to be appropriated for. And this was like a program that the situationists had, this performative approach to liberate the individual from these commercially induced desires, so that the individual would have the possibility of disconnect from all these things which are the desires which are created by the media and by society and by all these expectations, and actually having a chance to reconnect with what one's actual desires can be. So
I think that's right. I mean, my point about this, of course, is that I don't think cities were intended to be used in one way or another. In a sense, that's the whole point. So the idea that they were doing something that is somehow counter to some grand plan. There are cities that were designed for grand plan purposes, and do you know what? They very rapidly turn into ordinary cities like everywhere else. Mm-hmm. If you have a look at Brasilia, we're supposed to have a whole series of rules around who lived where, and people from certain ministries would live in certain housing blocks and their children would go to certain schools. That very rapidly collapsed. Mm-hmm. If you have a look at the cities that Mussolini built in Italy, Sabaudia, places like that, these were designed for a fascist state, but they become, after fascism, they become like any other Italian city, a sort of anarchy of traffic and motorbikes and Fiat Cinquecentos running around all over the place. Yeah, all those spaces that used to be for troops marching up and down and parading in front of the Casa del Fascio, they all have just become parking lots. Yeah, and humanized because of that.
So I would like to ask if there's any more questions. We are a little bit over time. Ellen, I don't know if this is...
just checking. I think I'm all right for a little bit longer if there are more questions, but...
That would be great. Leon, you had a question before. Maybe you would like to bring it now, because but perhaps I gave them a little very short introduction on space syntax before, because some had a little difficulties understanding the video from ANFA, because this is also very new and there were a lot of new concepts. So I tried very quickly to give a brief overview about space syntax, although I'm also not a specialist. So there might be a few misconceptions.
Have you recorded it?
Yeah, actually I did.
I'll have to look at it and give you some marks afterwards then.
Ooh. Okay, well, we can do that. Then I can also...
No, it's all right, I'm joking.
No, that's always positive. But I think Leon had a question which had to do with how we can transform these central axialities of the city to adapt the city from focus on the car user to the pedestrian. But Leon, please bring it up.
Yeah, hello. So yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned the term axial lines, if I remember right, and that pedestrians like to go a direct way if they want to get from A to B. And I was wondering, doesn't it kind of collide with the ideas from the last decades to reduce traffic in cities and to decentralize cities so that we have more lively neighborhoods? So in what kind of way we could apply those ideas to give neighborhoods more of a maybe versatile and yeah, lively structure. Or, yeah.
Yeah, a good question. Now, I think my way of answering this is that cities, urban space are complex networks. And those networks, a single space can play multiple different roles at different scales of the network. So if I take a street, the street I live on, and I just walk 100 meters, I go around maybe 1 or 2 street corners to different streets. My street plays a role in the network that is within that 100 meters, let's say, that is one role. If I expand my universe and I start considering how my street relates to the network within, say, 1 kilometer, it can go from being quite an important street within the local to being a very unimportant street within a larger scale. And if I then start thinking about my city at the scale of tens of kilometers or maybe more, maybe hundreds of kilometers, it's the Autobahn, which is the main connector at the hundreds of kilometers. It may be the peripheral motorway route that is the main connector at that largest scale. But that motorway, that Autobahn, is actually really unimportant from a pedestrian movement point of view, not because pedestrians are banned, but because it doesn't actually connect anything to anything that you would want to connect. Yeah, it actually probably acts as a barrier to the connections you want to make rather than anything else. And so the point about this is that the single piece of space has multiple roles in the city or in the landscape. And that is what you're manipulating. As you design a network, you're designing things to become local, important, but larger scale unimportant. Or maybe you're designing them to be locally important and larger scale important. So the main shopping street in a main city will be both locally well connected, but also large scale quite important. And that's a good location to put your shops. If you go out into the suburbs, then the local important space will be large scale, relatively unimportant, but that will be where the corner shop will go, where the convenience store will go. So this form of mapping allows you to understand how it is that cities have evolved and how the markets in land have distributed the land uses to different locations over time. And even for planned cities, so you go to Brasilia, yeah, the way that the informal economy has then taken over and appropriated space for use, to where the people go with the market stalls, takes advantage of the affordances of space. Yes, those particular properties of the network. And so if you just let any system run for a relatively short time, actually, and people just occupy it, if you haven't got Oscar Niemeyer coming back and telling people to move the street traders off the street, then it changes its use from his original grand plan. Now, he used to do that in Brasilia. He was famous for driving around and telling people that they were using his city incorrectly and that they had to, use it in a different way. And he was very forceful as well. He had great, great power in the system, and so the police would come out and move the market traders because Oscar Niemeyer said they were using the wrong space for the wrong thing. But since he's died, I think all of that stopped. So that now becomes something where it's a much more, let's call it, natural process of occupation of space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you may also have a good example in which area? Because I think for us interior architect students, it's quite interesting in which places people connect and where it works very well, for example, like where we can have a look. Yeah.
You're interior architecture students, are you?
Yes.
I didn't know about that. Okay, maybe you told me. Okay. So you have a very interesting task in the world, don't you? Because you have to take things that architects misdesign, the structures and fabric of architecture, and then you have to find a way of appropriating it for actual human use. So your task is incredibly important and a really difficult one, because sometimes you must sit there and think, why on earth did they do that like that in the first place? And actually, that's really important. So generating the sensitivity to be critical of whatever the architectural conception was, but then to find a route to turn that into a positive for the community or for the occupant, for the client, whoever they are, is a very specific role and an interesting role. How can I think of a good example on this? I mean, one of the sorts of examples was when Rogers and Renzo Piano did the Pompidou Center. They originally did not put any notices in the building at all. They waited for 3 months, saw where pieces of paper had been put up to give signs to say this way to the toilets, that way to the lifts, this way to gallery number 9 or whatever, and then went back and made the graphics to put the instructions in the places that actually were where the people operating the building had to stick pieces of paper on the wall with notices to tell people what to do. So that was a very intelligent approach. It was an approach that says, let's just leave it, rather than going into the building and putting a whole lot of graphics up on day one, because I think I can imagine my way into what's going to be needed where. Just leave it. Come back later and then see what people have actually done, because those will be the important pieces of information. And they'll be in the right place as well. They will not be on the wrong side of the column, and so on. So that's experimental approach, I think, is really interesting. I worked on a project several years ago with some architects who were working in an office and designing an office for an advertising agency. And the advertising agency were a young, innovative advertising agency. This is back in the 1980s, I think, maybe 90s. And it was a time where in Britain, there were just the terrestrial television channels, but the satellite channels were coming in. And they were very concerned because the advertising industry essentially makes its money out of television adverts. That's what a lot of the advertisers do. And in the days when there was the BBC, which doesn't have adverts, BBC Two, which doesn't have adverts, 2 commercial channels, you could guarantee to your client that if they went for one of the commercial channels, they'd get 25% of the viewing audience. Very easy to convince them that you put on a 30-second TV advert, they will get this coverage of people. But what happens when you've got 400 channels? And some of those are streaming and some of them are, you know, on. So they talked about the dilution of the media. And they said this is going to mean that we've got to work much more innovatively as advertising agents. And so they went to these architects, and the architects were very good, actually. And they said, look, we don't know what the answer to your question is. But what we'll do is we'll move into your offices and we will do some experiments in your offices where we will create installations. And so they moved in, they created installations. They would select a particular location and then use plywood to knock something up, very cheap. And then they'd observe how people used that space. Now, one thing they did was they went from everybody having a desk in an open plan office and some people having desks in the creatives that always have their own spaces with 2 people in an office, because creative teams in advertising have a graphic person and a word person. So one person who does the copywriting of the language and the other person who does the graphic. And they sit together, they're like marriages, creative couples. And they were in these sort of office cells. Everybody else was in open plan. And they said, look, if you could make your building be more interactive, then you would be able to increase the density and not take on a new building. Oh, I tell you what the problem was. The problem was that the firm was very successful and it expanded and it took on a piece of the floor below. And as soon as it did that and it was trying to operate on 2 floors, the people on the floor below were considered to be out of touch with the people on the main floor. And they said, we've got a problem. We thought we would just carry on growing by taking on more floors of the building. Do we need to get a single-story building that we put everybody in so they can all be on the same floor? And this is what the architects were working on. So what they invented was mobility. So they invented the idea of what they called the Real Office Mobility Project, ROMP. So everybody was going to become a romper. And they let people select to become rompers who would give up their desk, but for the benefit of occupying these installations they had constructed everywhere. So one of those installations was a kind of big packing crate with very high-end graphic computers in it. And you could have access to that if you had given up your desk and were mobile around the building. So this was an art installation approach to design. It's not going in there with a design. Here you are, this is your design project, now we'll build it. It was go in and experiment. It was very interesting. And some of these things they put in, they didn't work, so they ripped them out again. You know, other ones, they thought this really works well, there's always demand for this space. So let's see if we can find more of it somewhere else in the building that we can create. So our study in that building was to try and understand how it is that communication takes place between people in work environments. And so we went and observed people, we observed who was talking, who else they were talking to, we questionnaire them about who they found useful in their work. And we were able to say how the spatial design of the building related to the patterns of who found who useful. And we put that together with a whole lot of other studies we'd done of other research laboratories and other work environments, and came up with a generalized theory of how the spatial structure of a building relates to innovation. And
Well,
team.
that's a really good input to consider the experimental space in our planning.
So there's a paper on this called The Space of Innovation in Environment and Planning B. I can't remember what year it is, but way back.
So, do we have any more questions? We also accept questions in the chat. If you would be a little bit shy to voice your questions, you can also write them in the chat, and you can write them in German and I can translate them. Okay, everybody's a little bit quiet.
Very quiet. Very, yes.
Yes. Well, we started at 10, so perhaps now.
Maybe lunchtime.
Yes, exactly. So we had really a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Alan, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Good fun.
Yeah.
Always good to talk. Okay.
A wonderful time. So thank you very much again, and we hope to meet you again soon. If you would like to next week to join us for our talk about social networks and the effects of evil algorithms in our daily lives, you are also very welcome.
So is it about social networks?
Yeah.
Have you come across Kerstin Saylor?
No.
So Kerstin Saylor is also in the Space Syntax Lab. She's German, of course, so she could do it in German. But she's a specialist in social network type work, and offices and hospitals and built environments in general. So this is her special subject. Okay.
Well, maybe I will write her, and perhaps she would like to join us next week. We'll see.
She's very busy, but she'd be a good person to do a session with.
Great, thank you so much, Alan. So I wish you a great day, and until next time.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.